to the channel, you curd nerds. Now, if you are going to be a pilot, at some point you're going to have to read the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. And like any FAA book, it's a real good way to get to sleep. It's difficult to make your entire way through the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. So that's what we're going to do on these episodes. We're going to break down the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, Barney-style. And today we're going to focus on the first half of Chapter 1. It's all about aviation history. I'm going to take you from myth to modern flight with zero fluff, maximum sarcasm, and more cheese than Wisconsin State Fair deep fryer, right? We're going all the way back to before the Wright brothers, before airmail, before Garmin Pilot, before Garmin had opinions. So let's go full power, no flaps, and take off into the absurd history of how humans learned to defy gravity without dying too often. So, when flying was mostly jumping and hoping, before lift, before drag, before thrust, before center of gravity, and all that jazz that we learn about today, there was launch and pray. Ancient humans were absolutely obsessed with flight. Think Icarus, for example. Wax wings, sun, splashdown, poor aeronautical decision making, zero pre-flight, no NOTAMs. Then we got Chinese kite flyers. Some reportedly strapped themselves into massive kites for military surveillance. Revolutionary? Sure. Comfortable? Not even slightly. And then in the 11th century, we had monk Ilmir Malmesbury, probably pronouncing that wrong, who strapped wings to his arms and then launched off of a church tower, where he actually flew about 200 meters until he didn't. Then he broke both his legs and famously said he could have succeeded if he only had had a tail. That's right. This guy discovered longitudinal stability the hard way. Give that man his posthumous CFI certificate. So even today, students struggle with the four basic forces of flight. We got lift, weight, thrust, and drag. These guys were discovering them by accident and impact. If you've ever been frustrated trying to memorize airfoil types, just remember, you're already doing better than the guy who learned about CG by falling off a building. Enter Leonardo da Vinci. Around 1485, this guy with some big brain energy, a massive sketchbook, and low success rate. Da Vinci had a whole lineup of flying machines that never worked. Think ornithopters, flapping wing aircraft, helicopters made from linen, and even parachutes. Problem? They all relied on human power. You know how long it takes to get off the couch with modern protein powder? Imagine trying to take flight using Renaissance shoulder strength. But give credit where credit is due. Leo understood lift must be generated with airflow, streamlining reduces drag, and center of gravity at the very least exists. He didn't fly, but he definitely planted the seeds of lift. Leonardo designed a parachute that successfully tested 500 years later. A guy jumped with it in 2000. It worked like a charm. Moral of the story, never delete your sketches. Somebody might use them in the future to jump off a building. Now, the first time humans really left the ground with their own invention. The Montgolfiers and the first hot lift or hot air balloon. Now, in the 1780s, finally we got some actual altitude. The Montgolfier brothers in France invented the first working hot air balloon. First passengers, a sheep, a duck, and a rooster, because science. Why not? In November of 1783, they put a human in the basket. And for 25 glorious minutes, they floated through the sky. No engines, no controls, just fire, cloth, and hope. It was amazing. And also totally impractical. You couldn't steer, you couldn't go up or down on command. They basically invented a leaf. They had no control. So, why weren't balloons used in the future? Sure, hot air balloons gave us our first taste of the skies, but had all the directional control of a paper towel in a thunderstorm. The concept of lift was now real, though, but we needed some kind of propulsion and control surfaces to make flying actually useful. Still, it was a big moment for aviation. It was the first time that humans had gotten themselves off of the ground without launching themselves like projectiles. Now, by the 1800s, smarter folk began experimenting with gliders. Enter Sir George Cayley, or also known as the father of aerodynamics. While everyone else was flapping around like sad pigeons, Cayley said, "Hey, what if the wings stayed still?" He created fixed wing aircraft, separate horizontal and vertical stabilizers, and control surfaces that weren't just your arms. In 1853, Cayley successfully launched a man-carrying glider. Who flew it? It was his butler, because apparently OSHA didn't exist yet. Yeah, the guy built a machine, wasn't even brave enough to operate it himself. Imagine your boss coming to you saying, "Hey, I built this in my garage. You wanna hop in it and go in the air?" Yeah, obviously not. So that butler definitely deserves hazard pay and at the very least a logbook endorsement. So with Cayley discovered that wings provide lift, tail surfaces provide stabilization, pitch, roll, and yaw all need attention. That's literally the framework of every aircraft today. From your student trainer to your big shiny Airbus, his big epiphany that thrust and lift must be separated. The wings make you fly, the engines get you moving, and boom, modern flight logic unlocked. Seems really simple today, but we had to work up to that. So, to recap, humans started with feathers and failure. Leonardo sketched more than he built. Hot air balloons got us into the sky, but no controllability. And gliders finally gave us real, repeatable flight. We're not at Kitty Hawk yet, but the runway is definitely paved, and the proverbial crosswind component is manageable. Now we're going to dive into the Wright brothers. Brainstorming lunatics, airmail routes, and actual concrete arrows on the ground, and the beginning of organized aviation. The Wright brothers. So it's December 17th, 1903, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The winds are about 27 knots and gusty. Enter Orville and Wilbur Wright. These are two bike mechanics from Dayton, Ohio. These guys weren't rich. They weren't engineers. They were just really into building stuff and refusing to accept the laws of physics as they stood. And they also had a good bit of money from their sister. There's a big thing that gets left out. Their sister had money and funded their entire nonsense. But they'd spent years testing airfoil shapes in a homemade wind tunnel and developed 3-axis control. Roll via wing warping, pitch via elevators, and yaw via rudders. The stuff that you've probably heard me talk to students about countless times. Their machine, the Flyer 1, a wood and fabric, homemade 12 horsepower engine. Top speed, not so fast. Climb rate, but at the very least it flew. The first flight, it was 12 seconds and 120 feet. Longest flight of the day, 59 seconds and 852 feet. And yay! Just like that, history was changed. Controlled, sustained, powered flight was real. It wasn't a myth. The Wrights, they didn't get lucky. They were really the first to truly combine effective lift, thanks to their wind tunnel data, stability and control, and propulsion, no matter how humble their propulsion was. They didn't invent every part of the airplane, but they did put it all together into one nice little package that could be flown, and most importantly, be flown again. They literally changed the world with wood, glue, bed sheets, Midwestern stubbornness, and a sister that was willing to fund their entire endeavor. Fast forward to the 1910s and 20s. The Wrights showed that it could be done, and suddenly, everyone and their dog was building airplanes in their barns. But they weren't Cessnas. They were made from leftover war materials, bicycle parts, and wood that probably still had bark on it, if we're going to be honest. Barnstormers were the influencers of their day. they'd fly into town, do loops, stalls, offer rides for a few bucks, and move on before anyone could report the noise complaint. Stunts included wing walking, mid-air transfers between airplanes. Remember when Red Bull tried to do that? Standing on wings with parasols, and flying through barns, hence the name Barnstormers. And of course, none of this was FAA approved because there literally was no FAA yet. It was the wild, wild west of aviation. Some people might even refer to it as the golden era of aviation. I'll let you have that argument down in the comments. But now, as cool as it was to watch someone climb out onto their wing while inverted, aviation still hadn't proved itself as practical use. Enter airmail. In 1918, the U.S. War Department and the Postal Service teamed up and they thought, hey, let's use these little flying doobie dangles to deliver mail faster than trains. First official flight, New York to Washington, D.C. How do you think it went? Didn't go well. Pilot got lost, landed at the wrong place, still delivered the mail though. Kind of. Eventually, the Postal Service took full control, creating the transcontinental airmail route from San Francisco to New York with 13 planned stops. To help the pilots, the government, they built these big old concrete arrows on the ground pointing towards the next stop. At this concrete arrow, they had a generator and a 50-ish foot tall tower that had a rotating beacon up at the top so that the pilots could hopefully see that little blinky light either in the clouds or at night. This is like prehistoric GPS, VOR, ADFs. None of that was around. So this is really some base level navigation. So the pilots, they flew in open cockpit biplanes with no radios, no weather forecasts, no terrain warnings, no ADSB, just paper maps, oil-stained goggles, and balls that would upset the modern-day weight and balance of a Cessna 172. Some pilots were so exhausted, they'd crawl into the mailbag compartment and take a nap during stopovers, usually in an unheated hangar, no hotels, no duty day limits, just a thermos of bad coffee, the sound of leaking oil pans to lull you to sleep. Could you imagine that in modern days? But by now, aviation was booming by 1926, at the very least. But also, a lot of people were dying. Crashes were common, planes were uninspected, pilots could barely see over the nose, let alone read a sectional. So, in 1926, Congress passed the ACA, or Air Commerce Act, the first step towards organized aviation. Some people would say that this was the end of the glory days of aviation and the start of the modern days of aviation. But this act required pilots' licenses to set standards for airworthiness, introduced airways and navigational aids, and gave the Secretary of Commerce the authority over aviation. This was the great grandparent of the FAA. It was the first time in flying history that the U.S. regulated it. Before that, it was really just a sketchy hobby. It also gave birth to lighted airways, which used those beacon towers I mentioned earlier, towers about every 10 miles along major air routes with big numbers on the side so pilots could ID their route at night. Imagine trying to dead reckon across Nebraska by looking for a blinking number 14 in the distance at 500 AGL. Yeah, I'm so glad we have GPS. So, pilots licensing started here too. The first license, who do you think got it? I'll wait just a little bit so you can let me know in the comments. Who do you think was the first person to get their pilot's license? Do you think it was Orville? Do you think it was Wilbur? Nah, they were done with flying by then. It actually went to William P. McCracken Jr. One hell of a name. The head of the Aeronautics branch. 3 months later, they had also issued the first mechanic's license too. So if you've ever griped about your IACRA login not working, just remember, it could be worse. You could be flying across the Rockies at night by the light of a 50-foot tower with a generator and a shed. Yeah, I'll take IACRA. Now, so here's where things are at, right? Flying is no longer just a party trick. It's a legitimate form of transportation. Mail could be provided economically viable. Regulation began to lay the groundwork for safe airspace operations, and pilots needed something more than goggles and a mustache to fly. But things are only getting started. Let's get into the CAA and the CAB. So in 1938, Congress decided it was time to formalize the chaos. The Civil Aeronautics Act was born, and with it came two new players: the Civil Aeronautics Authority, which focused on operations of air traffic control and safety, and the Civil Aeronautics Board, which focused on accident investigation and, wait for it, airline economics. They didn't just regulate flight, they regulated ticket prices. Who got to fly where? You couldn't just start your own airline and sell $49 flights to Miami. The Civil Aeronautics Board had to approve everything. This was the government basically acting as an airline matchmaker. You can fly this route, but only on Tuesdays. Oh, and your ticket must cost $87.20. No more, no less. Air travel was tightly controlled, but oddly luxurious. People dressed up. You got meals and coach. You weren't treated like a carry-on bag with legs. As the 40s, 50s, and 60s rolled on, we got serious evolution. Planes got faster. Welcome the DC-3, the 707, the Caravel. Airports got bigger. Jet engines replaced props, and international travel became a thing. Airlines like Pan Am and TWA and Eastern became household names. There was even something called Stewardess Charm School, where flight attendants were taught the etiquette, emergency procedures, and how to serve martinis in turbulence. But along with growth came a new problem. Too many planes, not enough separation, no radar coverage in a lot of areas. And in 1956, a TWA super constellation and a United DC-7 collided over the Grand Canyon, and all 128 people aboard both aircraft died. It shocked the country and exposed how outdated our air traffic system really was. Planes were flying IFR, controllers were doing their best, but the tools just weren't keeping up. So in response, Congress passed the Federal Aviation Act of 1958 and created a brand new organization, the Federal Aviation Agency. Spoiler, it becomes the Federal Aviation Administration later. The FAA, it was now in charge of rulemaking, air traffic control, pilot certification, aircraft certification, navigational aids, and flight standards. Everything was now centralized under one agency. And it was way more paperwork intensive. Even after the FAA took over air safety, the CAB kept doing its things with accident investigation, route, and economic regulation. This weird split lasted for decades, and it was like the FAA was your flight instructor and the CAB was your angry examiner, but also your accountant. So by 1966, the government thought we should probably have one department for all transportation stuff. So enter the Department of Transportation, and under it, the Federal Aviation Administration. Then in 1967, they had a whole nother agency, the NTSB, the National Transport Safety Board. The NTSB, it became, what do you want to say, the Sherlock Holmes of accident investigation. It was independent and focused on thorough incidents and accidents when it came to planes, trains, boats, buses, or whatever. The NTSB showed up, notepads, coffee in hand, with a whole lot of diagrams. And even to today, when a crash happens, they go and get the entire crash and they try and put the whole airplane back together so they can figure out what went wrong. Today, the NTSB investigates every major aviation accident. Their goal isn't blame, it's prevention. We want to learn what went wrong, why it went wrong, and what we can do to prevent it from happening in the future. We're not just sitting here going, pilot screwed up, screw you, take your license, go straight to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200. That is not what the NTSB's goal is. The NTSB's goal is, well, what went wrong? Why did it go wrong? Could we train you to do it better? Was there something that you could have done to make it easier? Was there an equipment failure? We're focused on learning and prevention as opposed to blame and punishment. Now, we can't really talk about aviation history in the United States without talking about PATCO, or when ATC really went nuclear and ended up going on strike. So In the 1970s, air traffic controllers, they were overworked and underpaid like your modern day Amazon driver. I don't think they were pissing in bottles though. But their union, PATCO, pushed for higher wages, shorter shifts, and better retirements. Pretty basic stuff. These people are up there making sure airplanes aren't smashing into each other. At the very least we could do is make sure that after 20, 30 years of hard work, they're not going to be destitute. Seems like some pretty basic stuff. But negotiations broke down. So in August of 1981, more than 11,000 air traffic controllers went on strike. Problem? Federal employees weren't really allowed to strike. So Ronald Reagan said, not today, Satan, and fired 11,000 controllers and banned them from all federal service and called the military in to temporarily staff the towers. How well do you think that went? It took years to rebuild the system, and the event reshaped federal labor relations forever. Even modern day airline pilots can't strike without approval of a governmental agency, even if their company isn't complying with their union contract. So remember the CAB controlling routes and prices and making it so that the only way that airlines could compete is purely by being better? Well, in 1978, Congress said, let's let the free market decide, and passed the Airline Deregulation Act. Suddenly, airlines could set their own prices, fly where they wanted to, compete freely. Competition exploded. Prices plummeted. Routes expanded. Some airlines folded. Others merged. And service, well, ask your parents what flying was like before 1978. They'll describe fine china, steak dinners. Now it's $7 for a mini Diet Coke and a middle seat by the left. After deregulation, the Civil Aeronautics Board, or CAB, they didn't have anything left to do, so it was dissolved by 1985, and the FAA and the NTSB became the main players we know today. And that brings us to the modern day. The FAA is in charge of keeping the National Airspace System safe, certifying pilots and mechanics, issuing regulations, certifying aircraft and parts, and desperately trying to process all the paperwork that you send them. But let's be real. The FAA, it's underfunded, understaffed, and often overwhelmed. Registration, delayed. Medicals, good luck. Phone calls, I mean, they're not bad if you call your local FSDO. It's kind of a love-hate relationship. And yet, they're doing critical work. Without them, no NOTAMs, no ATC, no standardization. The NTSB continues to investigate and publish amazing reports, and we pilots continue to learn from every single incident, big or small. So, let's recap all of this. We started with winged monks, rode hot air balloons across Paris, jumped to the Wright brothers, rolled into barnstorming, watched the rise of airmail, witnessed the creation of the FAA, survived strikes, crashes, deregulations, and now sit in the jump seat of a complicated modern system. And here's the kicker. Everything we covered still matters. When you taxi out tomorrow, that 8-issue copy, it's built on 120 years of history. That seatbelt sign comes from decades of accidents and lessons learned. So respect it, understand it, and share it with the next student who asks, why I gotta learn all this stuff? So let's wrap up the first section of Chapter 1 of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. Next episode, we're going to be primarily focusing on the role of the Federal Aviation Administration. We're going to be focused on the regulations. How do you read the regulations? How do they break down? What books do you really need to dig through as a student pilot, as a private pilot? And how do you as a pilot engage with the Federal Aviation Administration? How do you call them? How do you contact them? How do you ask questions if you don't understand the regulations and you can't afford a lawyer because you're spending all your money on $212 an hour Cherokee 140s? So if you like the podcast, make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit that bell icon so you get notified every time we put out a new episode. If you do have any questions, please make sure you put them in the comments below and we'll answer them at the beginning of the next episode. And as always, fly safe and keep it cheesy.